Unfinished business of the civil rights movement, la agenda pendiente del movimiento por los derechos civiles. And in the spirit of that being the topic we're looking at this week, I want to start you off with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. The quote says, "What good is having the right to sit at a lunch counter if you can't afford to buy a hamburger?" What's King saying here? If you didn't know better, if I hadn't already told you that this is a quote from King himself, you might think this is like a Malcolm X criticism of Martin Luther King, of his "I have a dreamy desire to be able to sit at the same lunch counter as white Americans." Clearly it ain't that. So what is it? It's King recognizing the next frontier of civil rights. Because while King was able to achieve an almost political equality for African Americans, the right to vote, and the right to access certain businesses and institutions, King realized that in order to achieve true equality between black and whites in the United States of America, he had to achieve economic equality. Black people had the right to sit at the same lunch counter as white people. But until they had the economic wherewithal to afford the hamburger that white people could, equality was still elusive. Economic inequality between whites and blacks is as old as the country of the United States itself, actually even older. But to really understand the type of inequality that exists between whites and blacks today, you have to go back to the abolition of slavery, the end of the Civil War, and the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that abolished slavery nationwide. This was an enormous step towards racial equality. It liberated people who had been owned as property their entire lives and made them free people in the United States of America. But put yourself in the shoes of one of those liberated people. What could you really do with that freedom? You were free. You were no longer considered a slave. But what options did you have? You didn't have a bank account left to you by your former master or owner with money to spend and build a new life for you and your family. You weren't given a plot of land by the U.S. government in order to build a new home. You had nothing. And as anyone who's ever lived in a situation where you don't have money to supply with what your family and yourself with what you need to survive, you're technically free, but you don't feel that free. And the feeling of freedom is something that's still elusive to many African Americans today because that economic inequality was never addressed. And some families that are descendants of former slaves have come a long way and have been able to work and build something for themselves that they can pass on from generation to generation. The legacy of slavery in those families is a distant memory. But is it that surprising that for some families it's not? That some families who started with nothing have struggled throughout generations to build something, especially considering that we know with the end of slavery, discrimination didn't stop. It's not like African Americans liberated from slavery had equal opportunity to build something for themselves in the Jim Crow South, as we've seen over the last few weeks. And so that economic equality was something that wasn't addressed then. It's something that wasn't addressed during the Civil Rights Movement, which is part of the reason it's part of the unfinished business that people are still working to address now. It's not hard to find evidence of the racial economic inequality that still exists in the United States today. Take a look at some of these graphs. Inequality, race-based inequality is everywhere. And the thing about this inequality, and this is perhaps what's most important, it's not naturally occurring. We did not get these results, these numbers, because black people are naturally inferior when it comes to having and building economic success compared to their white counterparts. These numbers only exist because of a centuries-old system that created this inequality. Slavery, Jim Crow, racism in general. That is the reason. That system is what created the racial inequality that we have in the United States today. And many of the people fighting the fight to address that inequality believe that only a systematic response can get us out of it. Like this isn't a naturally occurring problem, it's not a problem that's just going to naturally go away. It was created by a system, and it needs to be solved by a system too. Solutions to this problem vary, and some of them are more controversial than others. One example would be investing in historically poor and black communities. I think of my neighboring community of North Minneapolis, a community that has extremely high poverty rates compared to the rest of the state. The idea that investing in the schools and the businesses and the families of North Minneapolis could help that community to thrive and overcome some of the historical inequities that have plagued that community, which is a diverse community. It's a community predominantly black, but also has white families and Latino families and Asian families. And so that investment could help everybody there. There's also ideas that are more direct and more controversial. Ta-Nehisi Coates, you've got an article and other articles this week by a guy named Ta-Nehisi Coates, whose article is called The Case for Reparations. Reparations are the idea that specific families that have a history of slavery in their lineage deserve to be compensated. That they have experienced disadvantages in their modern day lives as a result of the historical disadvantages in the history of their family, and therefore should be compensated by the very system that caused those disadvantages in the first place, that being the U.S. government. So payments, money to families who have a history of slavery is another proposal as to how we could perhaps address the economic inequality experienced by so many African Americans today because of the history of slavery and Jim Crow and racism that put them in those disadvantaged positions in the first place. But your assignment for today is to focus more on the solutions proposed by Martin Luther King. I've got some resources here on Canvas available to you. Some are articles, some are videos of how Dr. King described the economic inequality of African Americans in the United States and how Martin Luther King thought that we should address the economic inequality of African Americans here in the United States. Your job is to peruse those resources, to try to gain an understanding of the problem and some of the solutions as Dr. King saw it, and to write me a paragraph that shows that you have that understanding and have done that work. And don't forget about your summative assessment final essay. Remember that every day this week is going to focus on an individual part of the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. Today we are focusing on racial economic inequality. That could very much be one of the examples that you're going to describe to me in your essay for the week. So as you're doing today's assignments, perhaps on a separate document, you want to be putting together some notes that you could use to write that summative assessment essay at the end of the week. I'll be back tomorrow with another example of unfinished business of the civil rights movement. We'll see you then.